everybody. Hope you're all doing well today. My name is Maxine Anthony. I am an employee wellbeing consultant, and my work is really around delivering wellbeing workshops, dance entertainment experiences, and team building activities. Today, I'm going to be doing a conversation interview with the lovely Celia. She is a relationship guru and an expert in loss, grief, and life-changing events and transitions. Now, if you are not aware, this week is National Grief Awareness Week, and it's running all this week from the 2nd of December all the way to the 8th. And I really wanted to have this conversation to debunk, demystify, and clarify what is loss, what is grief, and how can we deal with it in our lives. Nobody is exempt from a loss or a grief, as Celia is going to expand a lot more about that. But we just want to talk about how can we deal with it, manage it, and navigate it in our lives, and also how it impacts us when it comes to our productivity and performance in the workplace. This is also going to be a really valuable resource for those who are HR professionals, those who work in corporate, in terms of how you can go about supporting your employees at work when they are dealing with things like loss, grief, and life transitions and life-changing events.
Yes, so just before I do that, Maxine, I just wanted to do a little sort of like, just to say something here about people protecting themselves, because some of the things we might be talking about today could be triggering. So I want people to be mindful of that, and obviously self-care, and just to make sure that they're okay, because sometimes we might be talking about topics which are going to be really sensitive.
So without further ado, Celia, I would love for you to introduce yourself, tell us what you do, and we're going to take it from there.
Hi, Maxine. It's lovely to be here today. So, well, you've kind of summed up what I do already, but I deal with loss and life-changing events. So that means I deal with grief, and I deal with divorce, and I deal with other life transitions. So that might be job loss, disability, ill health, anything where there is loss. And I help individuals, and I also support employers who are trying to support their employees in the workplace who are going through these challenges.
Fantastic. So I really would love us just to really start with laying down the foundations. And what I mean by that, I would love for you to expand on what is loss, what is grief, how does it show up? I know a conversation that we had, you were talking about how loss, there's so many different ways loss can show up. And I think many of us are familiar with the main one, if you like, when it comes to someone passing away, a death, a bereavement. But you mentioned that there are so many other types of losses. I would love for you to expand on that so we can learn.
Yes, so just to be clear, so loss and grief are interconnected.
Right,
So we grieve for what we've lost, and when we've lost something, we have to grieve for it.
right,
So if we're looking at loss, so for example, loss is generally regarded as the death of something, which you just said, but it's not just about the physical death. That's a misconception. So it will include life-changing events such as divorce, relationship breakup, job loss, loss of health, disability, for example, and any other losses we incur in our day-to-day life. So that would be also life transitions. So that would include menopause, for example. So on that basis, this means that even if you've never suffered a bereavement, you will have been affected by loss.
yes. And no one's exempt. Everyone has experienced loss. And if you haven't, you will at some point experience some type of loss in your life.
Exactly. So when we're talking about grief, and I've just said, obviously, with all loss, there is grief, and we grieve for what we have lost. So that means that whatever the loss is, we have to grieve for it to enable us to heal from it.
Right.
But there are various factors which determine grief. So that includes the type of loss, the circumstances of the loss, um, in the case of the death of a person, the nature of the death and our relationship with that person. And how we respond to grief will be different for all of us.
Right. Okay. So I would love for you to expand on the term living losses versus non-living losses, because I think that is something really important for people to really be able to understand and what that looks like and give examples?
Yes, so obviously non-living loss is going to be death.
Yeah.
Um, and that is the non-living loss. The everything else is living loss. So, a relationship breakdown,
Yes.
your ex, whatever, will still be there out somewhere on the horizon, you have obviously job losses. These are things that you're it's almost like part of your day-to-day life that you're dealing with, which will be living losses. So anything that impacts you, so it could be a miscarriage, it could be infertility, it could be an accident which changes your life, that you
Yes.
suddenly become disabled and your way of living has changed. So you've lost a way of life and you have to, rebuild your life. Mental health issues, someone becomes a carer for someone who's got Alzheimer's or dementia, or someone has a terminal illness. It's impacting the person who has that illness or disability and the person who's caring for them. So they're all having life changes, life transitions, and they're all suffering loss or experiencing loss.
Okay. I think that's really valuable for so many of us to know, because I think oftentimes we kind of pedestal certain losses, and other losses we tend to downplay or we don't really pay much attention to, and we kind of can sometimes think to ourselves, well, why am I grieving, or why am I upset about this? Like, it's not that big of a deal. And I think we can sometimes kind of, you know, rank which ones are like a bigger loss and which ones are not. But actually, there are so many types of losses.
Yes, and loss is it's so individual because how we perceive things is how we perceive them. So it's
Right.
not how it's subjective.
Yes.
So any loss that we have is going to be the impact it has on us. So somebody might think, oh, well, that's not very important, but it's important to us.
Right.
So, you know, we all grieve differently. We all experience loss differently. We all have our own path, and we have to follow that path. And it's a process.
Yeah.
And people often say, well, you've been, this happened, so long ago or whatever, shouldn't you have moved on? Well, no, because there is no timeline for grief. It's not
Right.
linear. We all follow our own path, and some people will process things in a different way from others. In fact, we will all process things in a different way. In fact, you could find in a family, where siblings have been bereaved, that they will grieve differently.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you touched on grief. Let's talk more about that. What is grief, and how can it show up in people? I suppose grief can be so individual, but I'd love you to speak to that in terms of grief and the process of grief and the emotions that come up.
Yes, well, again, the whole issue of loss and grief is intertwined because you're grieving for the loss, right? So we have when we talk about grief, we talk about the emotion of grief,
Yes.
and we talk about the feeling that people have when someone has died or they've had an experienced a loss. And there's the loss cycle, which is an emotional roller coaster, which was basically created by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross back in 1969 in her book Death and Dying. And she talks about that when we've experienced loss and we're going through grief, we may go into initially we will denial, we will be angry, we will then start bargaining, and then we might get depressed, and then in the end we might accept it. But that's not necessarily the pattern that everybody follows, and that's very general. It's not something that you can say is going to be specific for everybody. It's just a guideline. But it's what happens a lot with people who are going through grief. They get stuck in certain emotions, and so for example they can feel guilty because they feel they could have done more for someone. They might feel that they have a sense of relief, that someone has died, because not because they are glad that they died, but because they are glad they don't have that suffering anymore. And then they can feel guilty about that. there's the loss, there's the lack, it's like if you've been a carer for someone, it's suddenly a huge change in your life. It's like a secondary loss. It's like that was your purpose, that's what you were doing. So there's so many elements to it. It's so complex and it's so individual that everybody's going to react in their own different way to it. And there is
Absolutely.
no timeline for it.
Yes. And I love that you actually talk about the fact that there is no timeline and that actually grief is not linear. Just even with my own personal experience of, you go through the sadness, the anger, the bargaining, the accepting, and then you go back to the bargaining, and it's not circular or linear. It's kind of can go like this. And with all the different types of loss, there are some losses, some people can go through the grieving process quite seamlessly, if that's a word, if that's probably the right word, whereas there is other much maybe deeper griefs that are so much more complex, where it feels very much like this. I wanted to ask, when people are experiencing these intense emotions, the overwhelm, the sadness, these waves of emotion, how how do people deal with it? Like, what advice would you give to people in terms of dealing with that on a day-to-day basis, where they still have to show up for work, targets still have to be met, you have to maintain a good standard in terms of the work that you're doing, how do you navigate that?
Well, you know, it is going to be an outpouring of emotion for most people. And that is something in the very early stages of grief. And we talk about acute grief being the first 6 months.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can't expect people to have a funeral and go back to work and everything to be fine. I mean, people are still processing. And some people, in fact, don't necessarily react straight away. Some people are quite numb.
Yeah.
And grief, you can go back into the office and people might think that you're fine, but you're not. And then suddenly it will hit you and things will start happening and you won't be able to cope. That sometimes happens. You get some people who are very good at masking their grief. You get other people who cannot cope at all. They are complete, they break down. But the thing is with grief, and I say this, you have to feel to heal. You actually need to let your emotions out.
Right.
So, that therefore can be a big problem if you return to the office and you suddenly, you just want to cry all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So, the working environment can be very, very difficult. And of course, it so much depends upon, you know, if you've had a bereavement. So, the nature of your relationship, the type of grief, how the person died, it's all going to impact how the loss is grieved.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you have obviously, various scenarios. I mean, sudden death, violent death, death following an accident, multiple deaths, following a physical illness, following mental illness, suicide, addiction. You've got to think about people who work in high risk occupations.
Yes.
If you work in, say, construction industry, sadly, there's a very high rate of suicide.
Wow.
You've got to think about people who are on the
in
front
in
line.
in construction.
Mm,
Wow.
mm,
I didn't know that. Wow.
mm.
Is there other industries as well?
Well, I mean, certainly if you think about people who are in the line of duty,
Yeah.
they are witnessing. So they are, they are witnessing death and misery as part of their day-to-day life. So you've got to think about those people, how that will impact them as well.
Yeah.
And yes, I mean, what about a situation where there is no body, there is no closure, or there's an inquest and it goes on and on? I have I was working with someone at the moment whose son died nearly 3 years ago, and the inquest is still ongoing. And
Wow.
so, she can't close that part of her life. So her grief obviously was a momentous anyway because she lost her son in terrible circumstances. But if you think about how, then that's really impacted her and her work and everything else. So, and her health.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of knock-on effects from grief and loss.
Wow. And I suppose the knock-on effects can be even more severe when you are not dealing with the emotions. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How does one
Mm.
go about dealing with their emotions? I mean, as I mentioned before, when you're going through these intense emotions and you're having to focus on work and it's challenging, it takes a lot of capacity out of you to do that, but we all have to show up for work,
Yeah.
how do you
Yes.
navigate that?
Well,
Like,
no, exactly. I mean, my grief is physically and mentally exhausting. That's the
mm,
first thing. It's really draining emotionally. And the thing with grief is that you have to process it. And that means letting out emotion. And you have to give yourself permission to do that. And a lot of people, because of work and having to go back to work, they suppress emotions. They stuff emotions down. And it's the worst that we can do,
wow.
because when we stuff down emotions, we start to get other things. We get physical symptoms, we get, mental health issues, we get all sorts of things, anxiety, depression, everything comes up because we're suppressing it. So part of what I do is helping people deal with overwhelming emotions. And with it's about supporting people, it's about listening to people, it's about meeting their needs. It's not, you know, people who are in grief are not broken.
Yes.
They do not need fixing, they are grieving. And
Yeah.
we need to support them, and we need to be there for them, and we need to be mindful of what their needs are. And it's like the worst thing you can say to someone is to tell them what they need. They know what they need. And it's about understanding. It's like saying to someone, I understand. Well, we all process grief differently, and every loss is different. So I would never say to any of my clients, I understand. I will say to them, I have a great understanding of how you are feeling right now, but you tell me. And that's really how, and it's listening, it's witnessing people's grief, it's being there for them. It's not, you know, people sometimes don't want to talk about it, but at some point they might want to, and they just want someone to listen. And
Yeah.
and just to be, I think we avoid grief so much. We don't talk to people. We kind of, someone comes back into the office and we don't know what to say, so we say nothing at all, and that can lead to
how
feelings of
how can
loneliness and isolation.
how can we deal with that then when someone is returned back to work and they're still having to manage this? How can people around them support them? What kind of advice would you give those around them?
Well, I mean, I think this is all about raising awareness and education in the workplace,
Yeah.
because we need to have open conversations about it. It's the culture of the
Yeah.
workplace. It's because I say it's something that people don't want to talk about, but we do need to talk about it because unfortunately none of us can avoid it. And when it happens to us, it's more important than anything else.
Yeah.
So, managers need to be trained to have be empathy, compassion, understanding. And also we need to think about how are we going to, manage someone's workload
Yeah.
when they're in a position that they might not be in the office, but also when they come back in.
Yeah.
And like support buddies, this is a really good thing to have. People who are, can actually be basically present with someone, in the sense that if they need someone to talk to. And it's, as I say, realigning workflow, and also in terms of teams, making sure teams understand. I think the worst thing that can happen is that if someone is not in the office, they return and nobody knows about it. Now, sometimes somebody might not want to talk about their loss or what's happened to them, but awareness is very important, that people then know that. So it's kind of like, it's the, we talk about knowing our teams. So when I was working in a bank, I mean, I had one of my team, he joined my team. He had lost his wife. She basically was getting ready for work one morning, and he was upstairs. He came downstairs and she was on the floor in the kitchen, and she had had a brain hemorrhage and she had died. And when he came back into the office, 4 months later, we kind of almost like rehabilitating someone into the office,
Yes.
and actually making them feel that they, so that they're actually in a safe space, and they can talk about it. And I was his team lead, and I remember him actually saying to me one day, I really want to talk to you,
Yeah.
and going out with him and talking to him, and he was literally just telling me everything. He just wanted to talk, and that's often what happens. I had another work colleague who had had a terrible miscarriage first time round, and she was really, really anxious with her second pregnancy about letting anyone know in case she had another miscarriage.
Right.
And, she was saying to me, it robs you of of a happy pregnancy. And she didn't want anyone to know. And I was having to support her and
Right.
then manage the team, because they were thinking, was she, Celia's kind of, why is she getting, privileges, etc., etc. And then having to actually talk to someone higher up in the bank about, how we can, accommodate her. So there are things that can be done, and you just often have to shift workflow within the team
Yeah.
and move things around. And I say a lot of it is about understanding, a lot of it is about education, a lot of it is about awareness, information. One of the great things to do is say to put a video like this on an intranet,
Yeah.
so that someone who is going through it can think, okay, I'm not behaving in a strange way. This is normal.
Yes.
I need to feel to heal.
Yeah.
And, there are people out there who can support me, and I can do this at my own pace. And anyone who tells you move on, ignore them, and we don't move on anyway, we move forward.
I love that. We don't move on, we move forward. Okay, we're going to circle back, but I actually want to move on and talk about the different types of losses. Now, I know we spoke about this briefly, and I was so shocked at, I think you mentioned there's 30 different types of loss. I mean, I can probably think of maybe five, but yeah, can you expand on that, the different types of loss?
So, well, are we talking about the different types of loss, or the categories of grief? Because obviously different types of loss will obviously be, we've talked about bereavement, we've talked about divorce, job loss, disability, ill health, infertility, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that can go on. That could be a very, very long list, because,
Right.
or any loss that we've had is going to be a loss. But if we talk about, let's say, the categories of grief, and I'll try and do it in alphabetical order so I can remember. I can give
Yes,
you probably
that's it.
I'll try and give you about a dozen off the top of my head. So first of all, ambiguous grief. So what do I mean by that? Well, that's grief that's hard to see. So, for example, a miscarriage or infertility. The
Right.
person who has it, well, we don't necessarily, because they think, well, there's no child, but um, that is ambiguous grief.
Right.
And so, whilst we don't have a little person to grieve, the person who has been through that is feeling that loss. It's huge loss. The inability to have a child, or obviously having miscarriage, these are huge losses.
Yeah.
So then we have anticipatory grief. And I've touched on that. So anticipatory loss. So for example, if you're caring for someone who has a terminal illness, and you anticipate their loss, because they're not going to be with you for that much longer, and that's called anticipatory loss. But also, it could be relating to the loss of a job. If you're worried about being made redundant, that
Yeah.
could be an anticipatory loss. Or a relationship where you think that someone might leave you, so all of that is anticipatory. Then we get things like complicated loss. So these are the things where we have the loss of a child, death by suicide. These are very, very complicated, complex losses.
Yeah.
Many layers to those losses, as you obviously can imagine. And then we have cumulative loss. So that could be, for example, where we were looking at not necessarily, say, losing everybody at the same time, but multiple losses during a short period of time.
Yeah.
And it's the unattended grief from, say, you could have three losses and you might not fully grieve for loss number one and loss number two. And then you get to loss number three, and then it's just like this wall of grief.
Right. Yes.
So, yeah. And I think, there's also, we have to think about trauma here as well, because trauma if there's trauma, it's like this from a previous loss or something that's happened in your life, that can be carried forward, and this then manifests. And it's like, why is this so magnified? But because these are issues that have not been addressed.
Yeah.
So, for example, you could have, in a case where you might regard something as a small loss. I don't know. Say, for example, I didn't get the job, right? Then it's like, why is that such a huge trigger for somebody? Because they've had other losses and
Yeah.
it's cumulative. So it's like, well, other people say that's ridiculous, go and apply for another job. But I'm using that as an example, but all these things will actually be impactful. And
Yeah.
it's that cumulative effect. So
It's like they compound.
exactly,
It,
yes, exactly, perfect, compounded. And then you literally think you've got like I think it's like a domino effect. And then it
yeah.
literally all goes, once it starts to go, the wall of grief,
Yeah.
then it obviously, and I say that we call it the river of grief, and that starts to flow. So then you can imagine how that's going to be very emotional and very difficult for people. And then we have things like collective grief. So
Yes.
outpouring of grief, like with Princess of Wales Diana when she died, obviously when Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II died. And
Yeah.
and I think we mentioned, I think when we spoke before, when pop stars die, because it's
Yeah.
almost
When
like
pop
people,
stars, when
Prince
Chandler, I
or
think it was
George
last year.
Michael, yeah, all
Yeah,
these
George
people.
Michael, when Chandler passed away, I think it was
Yes,
last year.
exactly.
That was a huge hit for so many people. I actually remember years, I mean, this is years ago when I found out Prince died. And I'm a big, great, big, huge fan of Prince. And I remember I was on the train, like the overground Camden train. I remember it like it was yesterday. And it came up on my phone, and it was so visceral for me. I was on the train, I was like, and like people are looking at me, and I was like, Prince just died. Like it really affected me, and I was on my way to teach a class, and it took a lot of energy for me to just really kind of gather myself so I can deliver my class. But you know, yeah, just collectively, when someone that we admire, that we look up to. I grew up with a lot of Prince music, and Prince music is associated with family and things like that. Like, yeah, it can hit you, just as much as the more personal grief as well. Yeah,
I
very
think
interesting.
I
You
think
read?
as well, yes, and I think as well, what was really interesting, and I think what's really significant when, Her late Majesty the Queen, when she died, was that, for all of us, we have not known any other monarch. So
Yeah,
that was like stability, that was like security, she was part of our life,
yeah,
and it was like suddenly she wasn't there, and that's like, oh, we're, our foundations.
yeah,
So that's the outpouring of grief, I think, for that, people are very, very sad. And
yeah,
because it's suddenly, wow, life as we know it has changed. And of course, this is what happens with all grief, life as we know, because we then change, because our
yeah,
lives change forever.
yeah.
So yes, and collective grief is very impactful. And you think about the pandemic as well.
Yes, yes. I was
That's the
going to
loss.
mention that.
And
Yeah,
people had so many losses I mean, I lost obviously my elder brother during the pandemic as well. And so when we had the whole change of life, the way of life, and then all the losses, it was very, very heavy, dense energy all through that time. And obviously so much loss, so much suffering.
yeah.
So
Um,
yes,
you
yeah.
mentioned another one, or maybe you did mention it, but I just wanted to mention it as well. Disenfranchised grief.
Yes, I'm going to come to that because I'm going to
Ah,
come to
okay,
my Ds. So I'll do that one next. So
okay.
disenfranchised grief is grief we judge or minimize. So for example, that could be, say, someone has somebody might regard when looking at them as a minor loss. As I say, like you didn't get the job, or you're only dating that person for a couple of weeks. Why are you so upset? You know what I mean? So that's what we would kind of regard as disenfranchised loss. You also get delayed, and the delayed grief, and that's a lot obviously with, say, someone who's in the armed forces, because if you think about someone's in combat or on a mission, they cannot process their loss, they're having to get on with their job.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot also in, as I say, in emergency services, people on the front line, because they witness things and they have to carry on, but it's going to impact them down the line.
Yeah.
So all of that as well. And anybody could have the delayed grief, because as I say, you could also be numb to grief. And
Yeah.
then it's like there's a suddenly you think you're doing okay, and then suddenly, why am I feeling this way? What's happening? And that's, delayed shock, all sorts of things that are coming out, and obviously we get a lot of here, back in the First World War, people have shell shock. Now we've got, PTSD.
Mm.
So, that's really what the delayed grief would come into. And then, of course, there's inconclusive grief where, say, there's no body. Um, and so, for example, I had a case where someone was actually died in a mining explosion. There was nothing left of him to find. So, when there's been, people have had, aircraft victims, and, you know, there is nobody to grieve. So that's inconclusive grief, which is also very complex as well. And then masked grief, which I think I may have mentioned or may not, but talking about in the workplace, when people come back into the workplace and you could be concealing it, everyone thinks you're fine, but underneath you're not.
Yeah.
And with masked grief, it's often noticeable that people have very negative coping strategies. They might be overworking.
Yes.
They
Yeah.
may have, they may be drinking, they may have unhealthy eating habits, they may be over exercising. It's just a way of almost like trying to process it, but it's not dealing with the actual emotion of it. So it's an unhealthy way. And then, of course, we obviously have traumatic, you know, grief, which could come from having complicated grief, but also trauma from the nature again of the death, the circumstances. So, for example, someone who's stabbed, or someone who, obviously, died by gunshot wound, all those things, or was in a terrible accident. These are all very, very traumatic. And then, of course, we get secondary losses. And secondary losses, they're all the things. So, for example, if you're, say, for example, I don't know, you're with someone, you're planning to get married to them, and then they die, then it's like the loss would also be things like loss of that future with them,
Yeah.
loss of all the plans that you've made, the
Yeah.
loss of having what might have been with them. And it's all the things like, people lose their jobs, you get loss of identity, loss of the role, loss of a way of life. So there are so many. So this is really touching on it, but that's a kind of snapshot of the different types. And just to give people an idea, if they're thinking, oh wow, why am I feeling this way? This is because this is the loss, this is the grief
Yeah.
that you're going through right now.
Yeah.
You know?
This is really valuable information because, when HR professionals, when leaders, just when individuals can listen to this, learn and educate themselves on the different types, and they might have someone in mind, or it might be them themselves thinking, oh my gosh, I can relate to that. Yeah, I can remember a time, or it's just bringing awareness, and so we know how to best look after ourselves and each other. Can you expand on how how best to deal, manage loss and grief? I know you touched on being able to being giving yourself permission, but also processing the emotions. That's probably the first stages. What other ways would you suggest in terms of managing loss and grief?
Yes, I mean, the thing is with all of the losses, they really impact heavily on our pillars of well-being. So, our physical health, our mental health, our emotional well-being, how we interact with other people. So how we process it and what we do to try and help ourselves, is all to the greater good. And I think that really, one of the things is making sure that you are surrounded by people who support you.
Yes.
You know, you don't want to be surrounded by people who tell you what to do, or tell you how to feel, tell you how to think, because, you know, unfortunately, those people are not going to do you any favors, and it's not going to help you going through the process. You know, you need to be people who actually care and support you and listen to you. And I think, you know, so yes, you do need to give yourself permission, but you also need to think about, you know, one of the things that I actually, and this was where you come in, because, you know, I always talk about movement.
Yes.
And, you know, negative energy stuck in the body, we need to move. We need to move through that energy. We need to push it out of our body. And one of the best things to do that is to exercise. You know,
Yeah.
to go out to dance is fantastic. Actually, it does relieve a lot of stress and tension anyway.
Yeah.
It also helps with
Dancing.
the emotion. Yes.
And just even just as simple as walking or um running, it doesn't, because I think sometimes people can be intimidated by dancing and they just think, oh, it's too much and it's steps and whatever. But just doing things that you do, that everybody walks, even
Yes.
run, like really just, engaging in movement like that. I remember a time, well, it was in 2018. I had one of my worst years ever. I had a lot going on physically, mentally, emotionally. It was a rough year. And I think one of the things that kept me going actually was moving my body. And for a period of time, I was bedridden. I actually couldn't get out of bed. But when I could get out of bed, I would just walk around the block. And just being able to walk around the block was just so, it did a lot for me. It nourished me, actually. It got me shifting the energy. So from someone who, you know, my background is professional
Mm,
dancing to then being bedridden, that is a form of a loss. I was like,
absolutely.
yeah, I didn't, it was tough. But when I could get up and walk, I put my music on, music and moving my body, which is actually part of my framework in the work that I do with
Yes.
but yeah, that saved me. I can't even begin to tell you that saved me, because it is just shifting that energy. um
Yes. Keeping physically active is really important. I think obviously, you know, grief is very draining emotionally. It's physically exhausting. So,
yeah,
you know, you need to rest, but you also need to move. And
yes,
spending time, you know, with friends, spending time in nature, and actually even sometimes just spending time alone, but
yeah,
doing something you might want to do. It's like, you know, giving yourself permission to say no, but also giving yourself permission to say yes. It's also very important. And we talk about gratitude, and people say, what have I got to be grateful for? And I always say to people, you can find at least one thing to be grateful for
always,
today.
always,
You can
yeah.
always find something to be grateful for. And I think, you know, it's just we're also about breathing, because when
Mm,
we are very stressed, we don't breathe deeply.
yeah.
And it's about, you know,
To
breathing. And
breathe up here, it's all up
yeah,
here. Yeah,
exactly. And we need to kind of ground ourselves and bring ourselves
yeah,
down
yeah,
out of our head into our bodies
yes,
and to breathe.
yes,
You know, it's allow and it creates space, you
yeah,
know. And you have to, you know, and in terms of creating space, you need to create space to allow space for your feelings as well,
yes,
you
yeah,
know. So those are things that I would say. And also, I mean, if there are resources that you can take advantage of, then take advantage of them, you know. I
yeah,
mean, if there are inside of the workplace, outside of the workplace, if you need professional help, reach out for it, build
yeah,
a support network, you know. That's really important. But I think, you know, what happens a lot is, I said, you know, I talk about, you know, people not broken. They don't need fixing when they're grieving. They're grieving, and I think a lot of, you know, sometimes people feel the need. I want to fix someone. I want to make things better, and you can't make things better in the sense that you cannot, because can you bring the person back, or can you undo the loss? No, you can't. So
yeah,
you know, you have to work with that loss. And it's so saying to someone, well, you know, I mean, saying to people things like, well, it was for the best, or, you know, this person had a good innings. This is all what we call toxic bright siding, toxic positivity or bright siding.
yeah,
So, you know, you just don't say that to people. It's not constructive. It doesn't help them. And saying, well, you know, when this happened, or when you ask someone something and you start talking about yourself and what happened to you, well, it's not relevant to them.
yes, yes, yes. And sometimes we think we're doing we're helping them, and actually it's not helping at all. This is
No.
really great. I actually want to now dive into the corporate space, the workforce. How can corporations become more aware of this? What type of things can they do to support their employees when going through a life transition, a life change event, a loss? What kind of things can corporations do?
Yes, well, so this is a very big question. So
Yes.
if you think about, you have to look at, so it's like looking at the dynamic of the particular organization. So, you know, what their ethos is, what their, what their, what their culture is, right? So you have to, do they have any well-being policies in place?
Yeah.
And do they particularly have any well-being policies in place when it comes to loss? And my answer would be, you should, because every aspect of well-being strategy needs to embed policies or procedures for loss within it, because it's an integral part of it. Because if you think about how loss is so integral to what happens in our personal life and professional life, and we don't change when we go into the office. We take, you know, those personal feelings with us. We might mask them, but actually, you know, we're not two people. We don't split in half when we go to
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
So I think it's like, you know, it's like, what is the culture in that organization? You know, are leaders on board with it? You know, do they, you know, find out, it's like finding out what do your staff need? What would suit them? As I say, one of the great things is many organizations that I've spoken to, they sometimes think, well, these are private matters, we don't want to get involved. And I'm saying, well, you are involved because the people are working in your office. And the thing is, it's like, you can do things in very subtle ways. For example, you can put training videos on the intranet so people have that. You can signpost people to things. You can put things on backs of, you know, toilet doors so they know who to ask or to find someone. You can have a
Right.
mental health first aider, at least to kind of who's there can observe, pick up where there are, say, you know, negative coping patterns or things that people might not be behaving, you know, in a way. You can train managers, you
Yeah.
know, you can train, you know, you can create awareness by running workshops so that co-workers understand, because actually when there's, say, a loss or there's a bereavement or this is going on in the office, this often can demotivate a team, or they
Absolutely.
could be overworked if work is redeployed, or their staff, the workforce is redeployed and then somebody's overworked. So you've got to think about that. They have to think about not just the culture of the workplace and what they want to achieve, but also cultural differences and
Mm,
also religious differences as well. It's all about recognizing workplace diversity, right? So
yes.
it's very, very important to think about that, you know, and think about what areas of loss do you wish to cover if you're going to create a loss policy, you know, because at the moment, you know, apart from it's very limited in terms of what is statutory,
Okay.
because there isn't anything apart from, like, if you've lost a child under 18 or you have a stillbirth from 24 weeks, then you're allowed 2 weeks off, up to 56 weeks thereafter. Apart from that, currently, and there are things in the pipeline. We hope that, you know, government will introduce things to create more for loss and bereavement, but there is actually nothing else. Some kind of grief policy, some will offer
Sorry,
compassion.
Celia, you cut out for a second there. Could you repeat that last thing you just said?
So I was saying about, I was talking about just the 2 weeks that were given.
Yeah.
Did you hear that bit? The two
Yeah.
weeks that were given, yeah. So basically, if you don't have that, you're dependent on the company to have a grief policy. And, you know, most places might be 3 to 5 days, perhaps, that you might have. Um, Apart from that, you'll be looking at compassionate leave, but there's nothing statutory here. This is all
Right.
basically going to be something that the company might want to offer. I mean, you could be offered unpaid leave, but hey, who can survive on that for a long period of time? And then about how is the work going to be deployed as
Yeah.
well. And then also, even if you're offered a sabbatical, for example, there's these are kind of issues that come in. And then also, you know, you could take holiday, but again, what, you take all your holiday? And it
Yeah.
doesn't mean even after that period of time. And they also need to bear in mind, say, for example, with a divorce, you could have things ongoing for years on end, court cases, go on for years. So issues over children, you think about flexible working arrangements. So
Yeah.
all those things that you can put in working from home. Now, also, if you have staff who work from home or globally, how do you manage, where are your check-ins? You need
Yeah.
to, to make sure these people are okay, you know?
Yeah.
And I think, it's like creating and implementing a range of well-being processes and practices that incorporate the different categories of loss. And that's really, what you have to, what an organization needs to think about is what we're going to cover. And I think it's also really also thinking about training and resources for managers and team leads to assist them, because they need to understand the impact and effect of loss on their team, how it can manifest, how to manage it, how to spot negative patterns, and how to then prioritize the
Yeah.
well-being of their team. And
Absolutely.
also support for them, because if you
Yeah.
think about it, a manager, a team lead has a lot of pressure, because they're in the front line when they're looking after the team or the person who's come back from obviously a bereavement or any other form of loss. Where is the support for them? They need support. They may need to talk about how they feel, because where is the support for the supporters? Because it's quite onerous if you're having to deal with issues. It's like if you're an HR as well, it's actually, how do you deal with things? How do you cope yourself with it, right? And as I say, educating the workforce about loss, signposting employees to where support can be found. So, obviously, if you have some have these employment assistance schemes, but are they specific enough? You send someone off for counselling, they might have 6 sessions. It could re-traumatize them. It could re-trigger them.
Yeah. And sometimes it can take 6 sessions for you to begin to feel safe enough
Even
to open
exactly,
up.
exactly, exactly. And it's like, getting that input from employees. What are their needs being met? What support or what further support do they need to have their needs met? It's really important. And I think it's also, if you're going to put policies in place, you need to review them. You need to get data. You need to look at, like, one of the things you need to look at is what's the data? So when we have a loss in our organization, or we've had losses, what is the nature of the losses that we've had? What
Yeah.
has been the impact on our business? So
Yes.
what about, we
Data.
talk
So
about
important.
absenteeism?
Yeah.
Absenteeism. So people are absent from the office. What is the reason for that? Can we
Yeah.
find out why? Then, of course, we have one which is slightly more difficult probably to quantify, but presenteeism. When somebody's in the office, but they're not really there because
They're
their head
not
is
there.
elsewhere,
It's just
and they're
like,
not
yeah.
exactly. And then you got
And I think also if your work, or if you're a company where a lot of your work is front facing customer service, things like that, and you're just not there because you're somewhere else, it does actually impact the company's brand, the quality of work, what is being presented. So it actually really does impact the corporations when they actually don't go out of their way to look after their employees.
Well, yes, I mean, well, yes, and that's absolutely true, because it's a reputation.
Yeah.
Someone could say, I was treated really badly at the firm, they didn't support me, and so I left. And
And you
so
hear that, you hear it all the time. People talk. People
they
talk.
do.
Mm.
And I think as well, obviously, if you're looking at things that that are negative from an employer's point of view, it's like, you will get this absenteeism, as I've said, this presenteeism. You'll get, you can get reduction in work performance and productivity.
Yes.
You will get a high turnover of staff. You
Yeah.
will Team morale, will be out the window, and but then they may leave, and then you're going to have to recruit people, you're going to have to train people. I mean, if I actually give some statistics here, because I know we like statistics, but
I do.
50 billion pounds is lost to divorce. 23 billion,
Whoa, 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 whoa. Say that again. Say that again.
50 billion pounds is lost to the cost of divorce. The statistics from a couple of years ago, 50 billion pounds to divorce, 23 billion to a bereavement. And these are from that's from about 90, I think it's from about 2020 from a Sue Ryder report.
Yeah.
And you've got, I think it's another from Sue Ryder was that 24% of the working population at any one time is going through a bereavement. Now that's bereavement. Now we're talking about loss.
Yes.
That's the bereavement. And on the figures that they did back in 2020, that would be about 8 million people. That's on bereavement alone. So if you think about all the other losses,
Yeah.
that's going to be considerably higher.
Yes.
And that's going to be, the bottom line for an employer is that they're losing money.
Losing a ton of money.
So the loss for them, this is a loss for them, right?
Yes. Yes.
So this is a huge loss. I mean, and you have ripple effects. If you don't deal with,
It
say,
does pay. It does pay to care.
it does pay to care. It
Yeah.
does. It does.
Which leads me, you kind of answered my question actually, because I was going to ask, from a HR professional's point of view, they potentially could be thinking, well, what's that got to do with us? As long as they show up and they do the work, like we don't really get involved in that. Why should we care about this? Why should we get involved? Why should we make this a priority? I think you've kind of touched on why they should, but if you've got any other final
Well, I
thoughts,
do actually. I do.
I'm sure you do.
Well, I do, the thing is this: employers do have obligations because while there is no mandatory support for loss, they have a duty of care to their employees. So you've got to think about, and I'm not an employment lawyer. I'm a lawyer background, but I'm not an employment lawyer. But some general points here. You have an obligation to ensure that your employees are not discriminated against. And certainly post-pandemic, you have to consider well-being and mental health of your employees to a greater level than you might have done before.
Absolutely.
And there are, in fact, legal consequences of failing to manage loss.
Interesting. Could you give us some examples?
Yeah. So, for example, here in the UK, I can't speak for, obviously, loss is global, of course, so it's going to affect everyone. But here in the UK, and it probably does apply to many countries over the world, so you could have an unfair dismissal claim. So for example, you have an employee hasn't been supported and you let them go for poor performance, but they can show that this was related to a loss that they suffered and they received no support from their employer, they could go for an unfair dismissal claim.
Wow.
You could also
They,
have,
they would have a solid case. They would
well,
have,
they have a very good case. I
yeah,
mean, they have a very good case. I mean, put it this way, would you want to be an employer who has to go through that? So you want to head things off before they happen, don't you? You don't want to be taken to a tribunal. So by a disgruntled, employee. And then it's your reputation.
yeah,
You could have constructive dismissal claim.
yeah,
That's where, so you're an employee, but you feel you're forced to leave the job because you just feel that they're not supporting you. And, I had a case of a client who had, she was working as a manager and she'd been her mother's carer for 15 years and her mother died and then her husband died from a stroke 3 months later.
wow.
And basically her manager basically said to her, well, that's, must be a great relief that your mother's died. And, basically wanted her back in the office after a very short period of time and was very unsupportive. And she actually left because she wasn't, and she was basically bullied into going back to work. She felt it was very, very unpleasant. So,
I love
and
that
then,
you talk about that because I actually want to touch on that a bit more in terms of can you go back to work prematurely too early? And when you're going through something like that and maybe one of your key players who is suffering, how it actually it can impact your talent, your pool of talent, and their performance, or even them leaving and moving on.
yeah.
But yeah, I'd love you to expand on that.
Well, yes, because I mean, well, this is the thing. So, for example, if often, so somebody might be signed off from work or something and be absent from work for a while, but then they're feeling that they're, under threat for their job if they don't go back or whatever, or they might, because also there's other things that can happen. It's like, well, they worry about obviously job security, and
Yeah.
then that's their financial security, but then they also worry about, they might have a situation where you're not going to get promotion now because you're not there, things like that. Are they going to be discriminated against? People think they're not going to be up to it. They're not going to be able to, they won't want them to be the one in the meeting because they might have a breakdown or something like that.
Yes.
So there's all these, you get all these other anxieties that come as well. And if
Yeah.
people are absent from the office, it's really important for HR, whoever it is dealing with it, to keep in touch with that person to make sure that they're okay and to kind of plan their reintroduction back into work
Yes.
so that they can maybe have slightly reduced workflow when they come back in and that their workload is shared or they've got support. Like we talk about support buddies, kind of, that someone kind of to support them as well. And obviously
Or
offering
even the
them,
option to work from home for a bit, because sometimes you can get on with the work,
well,
but if you can get on with the work in your PJs and you can go off and have a little cry, but then
funnily
get the
enough,
work done and still hit those deadlines, just
absolutely.
accommodating in that way can make a
Yes,
big
exactly. It's exactly about flexible working and checking in with people. So, you, for example, yes, because a lot of the stuff can be done from home. I mean, if you think about, when somebody dies, there's so much you have to do within the first 5 days.
yeah.
And that's when you're worst emotionally. I mean, it's like you're sitting in hospitals waiting for doctors to give you medical certificates. You're having to go and get the death certificate. You're having to register the death. It's like you're having to sort out the funeral. It's just, it's so much to do. And then you have to start thinking about all the paperwork that comes along afterwards. It's just your head is just like, this is happening.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you're worrying about everything else. And then, there's knock-on effects, financial worries. It's, people think, am I going to be able to, stay living where I'm living? Am I going to have to move? All sorts of things come up. So there's, these things are going to take time. These are not going to be things that are going to be resolved. You might need time off to see a lawyer. You might need time off to go to court if you have, a family case. You know, there are you have hospital appointments if you're, have ill health, all sorts of things. So there has to be flexibility. And
Yeah.
I think there has to be,
And
that's the
people
thing.
do remember, sorry to cut you again, people
Mm,
do remember when you are able to accommodate and be flexible. I remember many years ago, I was working in a dance company and my grandmother was pretty much coming towards the end of her time. And we knew she was going to pass within the week or so. And, we would get in the calls like, Maxine, come down to see your grandmother because she could go at any point. And I was just so filled with anxiety because I was one of the like main dancers. Like I had a lot of choreography and stuff on me, and so I couldn't just pull out. I had to be there because I was like part of the main show. Well, I was a main feature in the show, and and I also had to fly to Monaco. So, it was just a really stressful time. And I remember my boss at the time, she was like, look, Maxine, it's fine. Go see your grandmother. And she lives outside of London. So it was a hospital outside of London. Go see your grandmother, learn the choreography through the videos. It's fine. I know you're going to learn it. I know you're going to be fine. Like she trusts that I was going to deliver. Just go be there and then come back a bit later. That made such a great big
yes,
difference. Like even now, it's like over a decade ago, and I
it
still
impacts
remember
on
that.
you.
That
Yeah.
meant so much to me. And I was able to have my last goodbye with my grandmother before she passed. And that meant a lot to me that she gave me that space. Otherwise, it would have meant that I would have gone from rehearsals to flying out to then come back and not know whether I would have all my other family was able to spend time with my grandmother before she passed, except for me. I was one of the last ones. So it's
Mm.
just to have that little bit of accommodation.
Yes, yes,
I
it's
can't.
accommodating people, isn't it? That's the thing. It's like, yes, exactly. It's having that flexibility. And I think that's really one of the things I want to make about if you introduce these policies, you have to think, yes, of course you have rules and you put them into place, but there has to be flexibility in that policy because, you can't just have something so rigid. There has to be discretion sometimes.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So, Celia, I would love for you to talk about and expand on company culture and how the ripple effects from leaders, managers, HR professionals, that they really set the tone in terms of the corporate culture. I'd love you to just expand on that.
Yes, well, interestingly enough, I was working with somebody who was a CEO of a business who himself had a loss.
Ah,
And so really he was on board because he understood the impact that it had on him and the realization. He said it was well, eye-opening, as he said. It was, enlightening, because he suddenly realized, wow, is this happening to my staff? And so he really wanted to engage and actually, implement loss policies. And I think this is the thing. The grief and loss is something that we don't think about until it happens to us. And then
yeah,
when it does, it becomes all consuming. And I can state that social media, I could put posts on about other things, but I put anything on there about death and I don't get the engagement, because we are a grief avoidance society. We don't want to deal with it, but we can't avoid it. We need to have open conversations about it, and we need to build a culture, in a working environment where we are talking about it and we are, implementing policies that will actually cover the different losses that people might be experiencing in the workplace.
absolutely. Because nobody is exempt from loss, really. No one
No, you can't escape it.
can't escape it. So, we've got to find ways to face it.
You know what, Maxine? I challenge anyone watching this video today to tell me they've never experienced a loss.
Yeah. There you go, guys. Comment below if you're someone who's like, well, actually, I've not experienced a loss. Or maybe you have. I'd love for you to comment below if this resonates with you, if you've experienced something maybe in the workplace, whether that's positive or negative, or if you're a HR professional or a leader or a manager. Let me know in the comments how this has kind of opened your mind in terms of how you're going to support your employees going forward in this area. Like I said, this affects and impacts everybody. So it's really important that corporations really get on board in having open conversations. Why do you think why is it so hard for us to talk about it? Why don't people want to talk about
Well,
this?
this particularly in the Western society. Again, it is a cultural thing. You
Right.
know, we don't. It's how we deal with grief and loss. In different areas of the world, they deal with things very differently. And we're quite closed off in many ways, and we need to be open about it, because unfortunately, loss is part of life. I mean, and sadly, it's been a big part of my life, but I think, it's helped me when I was working as a team lead. My own experiences of loss enabled me to support my team, so it's like it's the understanding, it's empathy and compassion, for people as well.
Yeah.
And just giving people that time and space, and realizing that sometimes, they may not be having a good day.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Celia, I would love for you to talk about your background. I know you mentioned you had a background in law. What made you go into this specific kind of area? It's very, very niche. It's very, very specific. And, it's one of those things that, not everybody's dying to get into, if you like. I would love to know that what was your journey and this getting into this type of work?
Well, so I always wanted to help people, and I I became a family lawyer because I thought I was going to be really helping people, and I did that for 15 years. But I had in whilst that was sort of ongoing, I had a lot of personal loss. I'd lost my one of my brothers, sudden death, and then my father, uh, also sudden death.
Wow.
And then I witnessed my mother die in front of me twice, which was very traumatic.
Yeah.
And then we sort of were careering towards lockdown, and my elder brother was diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer. And I had to give up work again to be his carer. And sadly, when Jerry died, I decided that I didn't want to go back into the corporate world. I'd actually been working in banking before that,
Okay.
just before he died for a couple of years, but I didn't want to go back into the either law or banking. And I thought, what can I do to, use the skills that I've got, the professional background I've got, the personal experience I've got.
And lived experience.
Um, yeah, and I'd also, of course, I'd also been diagnosed with an incurable illness as well, and I'd had problems at the bank when they wouldn't let me work from home, and I
Right.
could see how I was being discriminated against, and it was like a hidden disability because no one would know,
Yeah.
and I had dealt with that and I'd experienced that as well. And I thought, wow, there's a lot that I can do to help people. So that's when I trained to become a certified grief educator. And that's when, during that training, they talked about the death of a relationship. And I thought, wow, that's my background.
Yeah.
Divorce and family and breakups. So then I trained to be a master practitioner. I deal a lot with abuse,
Mm.
which is another area we didn't cover today, but obviously that's all in the workplace, vigilance about people going through abusive relationships as well. And I obviously then did relationship coaching diploma and energy healing, and I now do sort of stress and resilience management training, and I'm currently doing my cognitive behavioral hypnotherapy, which is just to helping people more with the traumatic side of things, the therapeutic side. So yes, it's very much I really enjoy the job. A lot of people say to me, wow, you're dealing with a lot of misery every day, how do you keep so cheerful?
Yeah.
And but I'm helping people,
Yeah.
and that's very fulfilling, and I'm helping them help themselves,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
helping people move on from that pain and moving forward with their life.
Yeah. I love it. This has been so amazing, Celia. Thank you so much for doing this interview with me today. Do you have any closing thoughts, last thoughts before we wrap this up? I will be making sure that this is out to the public this week, as it is National Grief Awareness Week. Any last thoughts you want to share?
Yes, I mean, for anyone who's watching this, who's, been through a recent loss or suffering from loss or finding it very difficult to cope, please reach out for support, because there are people out there who do care and want to support you and have a great understanding, having had a lot of loss themselves, and really want to help. And what I would say to employers is this:
Mm,
invest in your employees, because your employees are your business and they are your bottom line.
yeah, really, really and truly. Celia, thank you so very much for doing this interview today. If people want to get in contact with you, reach out to you, where would be the best places to find you? Do you have a podcast, a website, or where can people
So,
find you to know
you
more?
can find me on LinkedIn under Celia Conrad. You can find me on Facebook under Celia Conrad or Your Relationship Guru,
Yeah,
or you can find me at my website, which is yourrelationshipguru.com.
perfect, wonderful. This has been amazing. We think about corporate and we kind of, we have our personal lives and we have our professional lives. And, I always like to say, with corporate is just made up of people, made up of humans, and, our personal life can impact our professional life. Our professional life can impact our personal life. And, in terms of the work that I do, you know, it's about ensuring that people are healthy and happy in the workplace. And, when people are healthy and happy, you get the best out of
You
people.
do have far more productive employees and
Far
happy
more.
ones, and you retain your staff.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what my work is all about. And what you do as well. So yeah, thank you so very much. And
Thank you very
yeah,
much for asking.
I will see you very soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care now. Bye.